Welcome to the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People with Dr. Stephen Covey. In this program, Stephen shows that effectiveness with ourselves and with others is based upon our individual character, not upon quick-fix formulas or manipulative techniques. Stephen also shows how we can better cope with our day-to-day challenges and teaches how we can overcome and even rise above our present circumstances. Implementing the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People can help to create a happier and more rewarding home and work life with rich and meaningful relationships. Stephen begins now by defining what a habit is and shares how to get the most out of this program.
The essential purpose of the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People is to learn how to lead your life in a truly effective, successful way. Now let me first describe what the 7 Habits material is by describing what it is not. It is not a quick-fix program. It is not a program of the month. Rather, it is a process of personal and interpersonal growth and development that will require not only your continuing best efforts, but also your patience. You see, you must pay the price over an extended period of time to fully reap the benefits of these habits. By applying this effort, you can expect to increase your capacity to achieve your personal and professional goals and to develop better working relationships with your associates and all of your loved ones. For our purposes, we will define a habit as the intersection of knowledge, skill, and desire. You see, knowledge is the theoretical component. That is the what to do and the why to do it. Skill is the practical side of how to do it. And desire is the motivation side, the want to do it. In order to make something a true habit in our lives, we literally must have all 3 components: knowledge, skill, and desire. Now, the 7 habits are simply common sense. That's common sense organized. But remember, what is common sense is not always common practice. So I encourage you to make the investment, to put forth the time and effort, and to focus on the kinds of changes you can make consistently and over time to develop these habits. The development of the 7 habits began with a study that I completed back in 1976. I wanted to study the success idea in America and how it evolved. So I got into the popular success literature and I went back for 200 years. The basic finding of this entire study was this: for the first 150 years, almost the entire focus of the popular success literature was on character, that is, on principles, what we might call the character ethic, attributes such as integrity, fidelity, courage, compassion, contribution, responsibility, justice, service. And then, because of many societal forces, as well as moving from the agricultural into the industrial age, the emphasis gradually shifted in the early 1900s, particularly in the 20s and 30s, away from the character ethic to what we might call the personality ethic, which focuses more on techniques and technologies than on principles, on how to appear to be rather than on how to truly be. The motto of North Carolina is most interesting: to be rather than to seem. That motto symbolizes this shift from the character ethic to the personality ethic. And now that we have moved through the industrial age and we are into the more advanced information age, this very trend has accelerated. And yet, because of the powerful changes that are taking place in the global marketplace and with the new technologies, there is a pronounced new shift back to the character ethic, simply for the purposes of pragmatic survival, to maintain competitive viability. I have never seen a closer relationship between pragmatics and ethics. That is one of the reasons why there is such an enormous and increasing interest in this material on the 7 habits, all surrounding those principles that are central to the character ethic. You know, one time I had a student come to me and say, "How am I doing in your class?" I looked him in the eye and responded, "You really know how you're doing, don't you? A lot better than I do. How are you doing?" And he kind of looked down squeamishly and said, "Well, not too good, I guess. I've just had kind of a rough time lately, and maybe I haven't applied myself as much as I should have." I responded, "You really came to visit with me to find out how well you had psyched me out, how well you'd psyched out the system, isn't that right? When in fact, you kind of know in your heart how you're really doing. Let's focus on what's really happening, not on what's appearing to happen or what we hope someone might think is happening." That little story somewhat illustrates this personality ethic, because its focus is basically a technique and an image focus. It's like the tip of an iceberg. The tip, or that part which is seen on the surface by others, it's above the water. The character ethic is like the great mass of the iceberg under the water. You see, people often do no work on the foundation where the great mass is and where the greatest long-term impact is. Too many people give all their energy and focus to the tip of the iceberg. That is, to learning techniques that others can see. But this material is based on an inside-out approach. In other words, it starts with the foundation and then moves to the personality. That's why we give our first energies to character development before we focus on techniques and how to be more effective with others.
Stephen now begins teaching the principles associated with the 7 habits of highly effective people. First, he discusses habit 1, be proactive, and this habit's underlying principle of taking individual responsibility for our life and choices.
Now let us begin with the foundational habit, habit 1, be proactive. Habit 1, be proactive, basically means that your life is a product of your values, not your feelings. Again, that your life is a product of your values, not your feelings. Your life is a product of your decisions, not your conditions. To be proactive means you take the initiative to do whatever's necessary to make good things happen. In other words, you're the creative force of your own life. To use the computer metaphor, habit 1 is the awareness that you are the programmer. It is the budding awareness that the best way to predict your future is to create it. The opposite of being proactive is to be reactive, which basically means that your life is a function of your feelings, your moods, your impulses, or how other people treat you, such as taking out your anger on work associates or loved ones at home because you feel so frustrated. You feel victimized. You feel like you're under the control of other forces. Other people are doing it to you. They're doing you in. So you feel you have ample justification and reason to essentially say, I am what other people have made of me. I am what my past has made of me. I am what is happening to me from all around today. See, and then not to take responsibility.
I grew up in a family that was very reactive. So it was a very painful and conscious process as an adult for me to learn to be a proactive person.
In my family, when there's a conflict, you fight. You yell, you scream, whoever's loudest wins, and you don't talk for 3 days. And then it just gets glossed over and you go on with your lives and it's never mentioned again. And when I started dating my husband, he did something that made me really mad. And so, of course, I yelled and I screamed and was very voracious about it. And he just listened to me very carefully and nodded and said, "I'm sorry. That was really inconsiderate of me." And I didn't know what to do. I said, "I don't know what to do now. No one ever gave me that kind of response. You're supposed to yell back, see? And then we do this for a couple of days and it's over." And so that was a very clear picture that between the stimulus and the response, I had something to do there. I had a choice to make.
Habit 1 is the habit of awareness that I am a separate person from all that has happened to me, including all of my feelings, my moods, even my genetic makeup, and so forth. The underlying principle of Habit 1, be proactive, is to take responsibility. The concept is, you and I have the capacity to choose our response. I am responsible. I am response-able. But see, it's much easier to say, I am not responsible, than to say, I'm irresponsible. Again, let's define Habit 1. Be proactive as the capacity to subordinate impulses, words, feelings, conditions to values based on principles. You know, we're tested every day in many little ways in the ordinary things in our life. And if we are proactive in those things, it gradually develops extraordinary capability in handling major setbacks or disappointments. We learn that we have the power to choose our attitude. We have the power to choose our own response in any given set of circumstances we can do nothing about. For instance, Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist, imprisoned in the death camps of Nazi Germany because he was a Jew, experienced unbelievable indignities and tortures. He was raised in the Freudian tradition that you're basically a product of your childhood and that you can do nothing about it. While he was in the death camps, he began to observe some very interesting things. Some people acted as animals, and others acted as saints in the same circumstances. He himself experienced terrible things. Some of his own loved ones were cremated, and he expected perhaps the same fate for himself, but for some reason they saved him for experimental purposes. One day they stripped him naked, put him under white light, and began to perform those ignoble sterilization experiments upon his body. This is when he discovered what he called the last of the human freedoms. That is, the power to choose one's own response to any condition, to anything that happens. And he cultivated a sense of meaning and self-awareness so that during his very torture, he saw himself in his imagination lecturing to his students in Austria following his release from the death camps about the very experiences he was having at the time, about the insights and learnings he was acquiring. And he came to postulate that the highest value of all is to choose your attitude in situations over which you have no control. In other words, between what happens to us, the stimulus, and our response to the stimulus is a space. In that space lies our freedom and power to choose our response. And in those choices lie our growth and our happiness. Let me say that again, because this is so fundamental. Between what happens to us, the stimulus, and our response to the stimulus is a space. In that space lies our freedom and power to choose our response. And in those choices lie our growth and our happiness. This is what Viktor Frankl discovered, and through exercising his memory, that is his self-awareness, and his imagination, and his conscience, by asking questions such as, what is this situation asking of me, instead of, what do I ask of it? Why are they doing this to me? And so forth. And also by exercising his own independent will. This freedom within became greater and greater until his freedom was in a sense greater than his Nazi captors, not his liberty. You see, liberty is a condition of the environment, of the external environment. Freedom is a condition of the person, of one's internal power to exercise options. We have control over our freedom, but we do not, in the short run, have control over our liberty. However, in many situations, not necessarily all, the more you control your freedom and expand and deepen it, eventually it will influence the liberty in your life. That is, the options, the alternatives that are available to you. In other words, eventually your head will create your world. Your response to the stimulus will eventually influence the stimulus, and to some degree, Viktor Frankl experienced that. Dr. Frankl also tried to look at the hypothesis of what enabled these people in the death camps to survive. Was it their survival skills? No, that was secondary. Was it their intelligence? Again, secondary. Was it their present health? Again, secondary. These things were eventually equalized and lost. They helped a little initially, but eventually they were gone. The thing that enabled survival was a vision of the future, a sense of meaning about a work yet to do, a contribution yet to make. And this became the basis for his brilliant autobiographical account of these experiences called Man's Search for Meaning. So we must not let the things we can do nothing about interfere with the things we can do a great deal about. Because remember, between stimulus and response is our greatest power, our freedom to choose.
This completes the first CD. Please insert the second CD to continue with the program. Stephen now discusses Habit 2, Begin with the End in Mind. Habit 2 is based on the principle of personal leadership. Stephen explains how beginning with the end in mind requires a sense of vision and self-chosen values, and applies to everything we do in our personal, family, and organizational lives.
Now as we go into Habit 2, begin with the end in mind. Let me first try to put it in perspective with Habit 1. To use the computer metaphor again, Habit 1 basically says you are the programmer. Habit 2, begin with the end in mind, says write the program. You see, if you're the programmer, then write it. Don't just live some other program out that you don't feel meets your needs and your values. You decide it. You write it. Look at it this way for a moment. Habit 1 is the habit of personal vision. That is, you have a vision or a personal sense that you have this internal power to choose your response, and that you can choose it on the basis of values. But notice that assumes values. That assumes a self-chosen value system. That's what Habit 2 is. Habit 2 is the habit of personal leadership. It's based upon that vision, but it's the program that you write for yourself. You take leadership in your own life, in your family life, in your work life. Leadership deals with the direction of one's life. You decide your value system. Habit 2 is based on the principle of personal leadership, of purpose, of mental creation, and of mission. The opposite of Habit 2 is to do no intellectual creation, to have no sense of mission, to do no envisioning of the future, to just kind of let life happen, to go with the flow with no particular focus, to begin with no particular objective in mind. So the second habit, to begin with the end in mind, is in a sense the test of our meaning. What is our life about? What is our identity? It is not to abandon ourselves and to live out the programs that others have given to us and then blame them for how poor those programs were. An interesting thing about life is that it is always created twice. Always. You see, the first creation is an intellectual creation. The first creation is of the mind and of the spirit. The second creation is a physical creation. The home or office or car that you're in right now was mentally created in every detail, and the plan reduced to a blueprint before it was actually physically created. The carpenter's rule is, measure twice, cut once. In other words, you've got to make sure the blueprint, the first creation, is really what you want, and that you've thought through everything. Obviously, the key is to begin with the end in mind. I think you can see the applicability of this idea to any field of endeavor. I mean, how useful is it that you have the end in mind when you're doing, say, a jigsaw puzzle? How useful is it that everyone has the same end in mind? You begin each project with the end in mind. You begin each day with the end in mind. You exercise with the end in mind. You go into a meeting with the end in mind, not necessarily that your decision is accepted, but that the group together produces the best decision and strengthens their relationship. In other words, this concept of begin with the end in mind applies to everything we do in our lives, from our professional life to our personal and family life. This is so basic with families and organizations. The fundamental reason, the root reason why families split up and organizations fail is that its members do not share a common vision. What if everybody participated to create that vision and purpose and worked to create it over a period of time to where they really owned it? They felt it. This is our vision. We share it together. To begin with the end in mind is the most important decision and the most significant decision. Why? Because every other decision, large and small, will be influenced by that decision. What are the principles I want to operate my life on? What are the principles we want our family to operate on? What are the principles we want our organization to operate on? You see, you're deciding what are the things that are truly important. This is a very fundamental principle, so that you have a continuing sense of guidance in your life. Then you don't end up climbing that proverbial ladder that is leaning against the wrong wall.
Highly effective individuals, families, and organizations do not really manage time. They manage self. Instead of reacting to the urgent and being caught up in the thick of thin things, effective people plan and execute according to their deepest priorities. As Stephen explains in Habit 3, they put first things first and implement this habit, which is based on the principle of personal management.
Now let's quickly review. Habit 1, be proactive, is the awareness that you are the programmer. Habit 2, begin with the end in mind, is where you write the program. Habit 3 is where you run it. In other words, you execute around it. The third habit is to put first things first. The opposite of habit 3, to put first things first, is to put second or third things first, or to put first things second. In a sense, you become bogged down in what is called the thick of thin things. Goethe said it this way: things which matter most must never be at the mercy of things which matter least. Now, habit 3, put first things first, is the test of our integrity. Can we walk by those first things? You see, in a very real sense, the second habit, begin with the end in mind, decides what the first things are. And the third habit, put first things first, is that habit of our discipline and our commitment to live by those first things. Thus, it is the habit of integrity, the habit of keeping our lives integrated. In other words, we walk our talk. That's the real challenge and the true test of our integrity and our maturity. Habit 3 would be the management principle of putting first things first, where habit 2 is the leadership principle in deciding what the first things are. In other words, in habit 3, you organize and execute around the priorities you decided on in habit 2. Now, essentially, habit 3, to put first things first, is the paradigm or way of thinking which focuses upon relationships rather than schedules. Why? Because people in relationships are the first things, and almost all people will come to that. The traditional paradigm or way of thinking in the field of time management has always dealt with time, with scheduling, with control, with efficiency. That is, doing more things faster. You see, that paradigm is focused on efficiency and control. It is called time management. You manage your time. The clock is its symbol. It drives us toward efficiency. Have you ever tried to be efficient with a loved one on a tough issue? How did it go? You ever do it with your spouse? How did it go? You ever do it with a difficult teenage situation? How did that one go? You see, right off the bat, you already know how foolish it is. But look at the paradigm that drives it. When it doesn't work, what do? We try to do it better. We try to do it more efficiently, more quickly. I had a boy one time that was into this kind of efficiency approach. He finally decided that the girl he was going with, the relationship wouldn't work out. So he put it down on his list of something to do for that day. Drop Margaret. In other words, study for this final exam, drop off this paper, then drop Margaret, then take this test in sociology. I mean, she was one of the many items. Now, because there'd been a deep feeling for each other for a period of time, he had scheduled 15 or 20 minutes for the visit. And he wanted to do it over the phone so that if she cried, she wouldn't be so embarrassed, and also that he could handle it rather dispassionately and efficiently. So he calls her up. "Hi, Margaret, how you doing? How's your test going?" "Oh, yeah, that was really a bear, and I don't know what to do about that. And what your situation? You got 2 more tests, huh? You prepared for them?" "Oh, yeah." And then he looks at his watch and he notices he used about 5 minutes in all this nice social talk. And then inwardly he said to himself, "Now I've got to get to the hard part." So he says, "Excuse me, Margaret, I kind of wanted to talk about, our relationship with each other and everything, and I just don't know if it's the way we should go. I've given a lot of thought to our relationship, and I'm sure you have as well, and I just feel like maybe it's just best that we just be friends. You know what I mean, Margaret?" Margaret, are you there? Now, don't be offended, Margaret. I really do care for you. I just feel like that maybe a friendship would be the best way to go in the long run. She was very upset, very emotional, and he just simply had to go over to her house. But really, talk about the disruption of his schedule. You see, we try to be nice, we try to be positive, but the underlying paradigm, which is not questioned, it's just an assumption, is one of control and efficiency. That we're right and the other is wrong, and gradually you turn people into a thing. Remember again, with people, fast is slow, and slow is fast, yet as effective. We want effectiveness with people, and we want efficiency with things. People are not things. Now, the paradigm I'm trying to teach is symbolized by a compass, not a clock, and it is based upon a sense of focusing upon the first things in our lives, and they're always relationships. This is also true in business. Relationships with customers, associates, and so forth. And the essence of all effectiveness basically deals with people and with relationships. And ultimately, these are governed by a moral sense of principles, that is, of what is right and what is wrong, and of integrity around those principles. This requires all of us to be sufficiently open and humble to just get into this kind of pair of glasses, this new frame of reference, this new paradigm, this new map that is based upon relationships, not schedules, based upon principles, not values, based upon leadership first, then management, based upon a compass, and then a clock. A good practical way of doing this is to write down on a piece of paper what to you are the most important things, the first things in your life, the supremely important things. Now, we're speaking of things in a generic sense, such as people, relationships, family, health, integrity, service, and so forth. What are your first things? Just list 5 or 6. This takes real deep thinking because you have to prioritize. In fact, you may wish to even pause this program momentarily while you do this little exercise.
In my life would be my family, my health, education, and a good financial basis to operate from.
The most important things to me are my family, and not just my immediate family, but my sister and my mom that doesn't live with me, my church, my children, my husband.
First things for me are my family. I'm the youngest of 9, and no matter where I'm at in the world, just to be able to know that they're there.
Family, God, career, people, those are primary. Those always take about the top.
The first things in my life are personal and spiritual development, relationships, and work.
Okay, now continue this prioritization. And this is the toughest part of the thinking process. What do you think is number 1? Then number 2? Then 3, 4, 5, and so forth. One effective way is to just cut out one. What would it be? Then cut out another one until you get down to that which is most important. Another way to get at this is to answer 2 questions. Think of one activity that you absolutely know that if you did it superbly well and consistently would produce marvelous results in your personal or family life. Now think of one activity in your work or professional life that you know that if you did it superbly well and consistently would produce marvelous results. In other words, think of activities in your personal and your work life that help us to secure the first things you've already identified. Now that you've written down what the first things are, and you've written down what is the one activity in your personal and in your work life that you absolutely know that if you did it superbly well, you would produce marvelous results, study that. Most of you put down in your first things your family, your loved ones. I know you did. I've done this all over the world, and that's what most people put down. You'll also find that you also wrote down about the same activities that would produce marvelous results. You'd focus on preparation, on prevention, on value clarification, on planning, on relationship building, on deep communication with the key people in your lives. You may have used different words, but the underlying meanings are almost always the same, everywhere. The point that we're trying to get across here is that we shift to this new paradigm, which is a way of thinking based upon principles and relationships, rather than things and schedules. In other words, based on leadership first, then management. Based on relationships first, then schedules. Based upon a compass, then a clock.
Stephen now discusses Habit 4, Think Win-Win. Habit 4 is based on the principle of mutual benefit and respect. Stephen explains how the attitude of win-win is a vital factor in leadership and in all of our relationships.
Habit 4, Think Win-Win, lies at the very heart of all relationships. Think win-win is the habit of mutual benefit. It is the habit of the golden rule. It is the habit of abundance. The underlying principle is abundance. In other words, there's plenty out there and to spare, so you don't have to be threatened by the strengths of other people. You can nurture competency around you higher than your own. It doesn't threaten you. You can share knowledge. You can share recognition. You can share gain and profit. Why? Because of abundance. But if people derive their sense of worth from being compared to the external, or from the social value system out there, or how well they stack up with others, they're always in a state of anxiety. They're always studying the pecking order. They're concerned about how they're dressed and how they look. They're into posturing, and they're threatened by competency around them. They feel that if they share knowledge, they lose unique advantage. It gives others the same awareness that they have. They lose some of their power. And if they share power or gain, they feel like they have less. You know, it's like a piece of pie. There's only so much. If you get the recognition, I may not get it. I will have less. It is the paradigm of scarcity, not the paradigm of abundance. Most people have never had profound experiences with win-win people. They don't really believe there's such a thing as win-win. It's either you win or you lose. You're either tough or you're soft. You're strong or you're weak. They think in dichotomies, either or, and they'll become martyrs. They'll go for lose-win and call it win-win, particularly among so-called important people. And then they'll often take out their energy on the ones that they can control, so that they're lose-win above them and win-lose below them. Then what happens at the side all depends on the moods and the ego of the people involved. Who's winning in your marriage? And what happens when your kids take you on? Do you take them on back? What about your employees? Who's winning there? Oftentimes, win-lose can become so vindictive, so acrimonious, that people literally are drenched in ego, and they don't even care if they lose as long as the other person loses. In fact, I remember a situation where a divorcee was just into such a win-lose spirit that he was told by the judge that he was to take half of his assets and sell them and give the other half to his ex-wife. So he took an $8,000 car, sold it for $50 so he could give her $25. You see, the win for him was twist that thing, see, make 'em pay. Some people almost temporarily buy so deeply into win-lose, and if both do, and they're drenched in ego, lose-lose inevitably results. In fact, in my opinion, in the long run, any win-lose approach or lose-win approach on essential jugular issues in the long run eventually will be useless and end up in lose-lose. Remember, principles ultimately will govern, so that if there's a spirit of acrimoniousness, a spirit of vindictiveness, a spirit of getting back, of getting even, it becomes a very deep violation with the universal principle of equity, of fairness, and of the golden rule. Can you begin to see that the roots of the win-win mindset comes deep out of the private victory of habits 1, 2, and 3? You see, if the private victory is real and sincere, you're at peace. You're centered. You're anchored. You're rooted. You're established. Your ego's not involved. Down deep, you're invulnerable. So you can afford to be vulnerable on the surface of your life and go for win-win. So habit 4, to think win-win, comes from the principle of abundance, not scarcity, meaning that the pie gets larger and larger and larger. In what way? Because through the interaction on a win-win basis, a transformation begins to take place in our natures to where we tap into more creativity, more resourcefulness, more ingenuity, more wisdom, more intelligence, deeper and deeper into the bowels of the organization. We see the problem differently. We define it differently. We come up with new alternatives that do tap into abundance instead of the one we've been considering that only was based upon scarcity. So that deeper in our marriage, deeper in our family life and in our organizations, this kind of win-win spirit can eventually bring about synergy, so that ultimately the whole is truly greater than the sum of the parts. We'll talk about this under Habit 6 later. Such an abundance mentality increases knowledge, increases power, and the earlier fears become unfounded. And if you maintain the attitude of thinking win-win, and the skill and method of Habit 5 to seek first to understand, then to be understood, you will create such interaction, such mutual understanding that it leads to the fruit of Habit 6 called synergy. New insights, new alternatives, new learnings, new heights. But it all has to start with the person. They have to begin to say, I'm going to go for win-win with people. One man said to me one time, Stephen, come on. I mean, the world just isn't like that. It sounds good, but really it's a little idealistic. It's not like that out there in the real world. The world is not into cooperation. The world is into competition. So win-win is just too much an ivory tower of theory and abstraction and idealism. So I said to him, I need to listen to you a little more. He said, all right, I'll tell you. We were renegotiating our lease arrangements with the mall operators and owners, and you counseled us as our consultant to go for win-win. We did. We were open, we were conciliatory, had a win-win spirit. They saw that as weakness, as softness. And then they took us to the cleaners. I said, well, why did you go for lose-win? He said, we didn't. We went for win-win. I said, didn't you just say they took you to the cleaners? Yeah. In other words, you lost and they won. That's right. Well, what's that called? I mean, really, it was like the lights had come on. He realized that what he called win-win was really lose-win. You see, lose-win is not win-win at all. People who think in dichotomies believe that lose-win, being nice, being soft, is win-win, because they haven't really experienced the creation of a new option, a new alternative, that is far better than win-lose or lose-win, called win-win. In other words, my friends, win-win is so much tougher. It's much tougher than win-lose. Why? In the early stages, you have to be tough on yourself. You have to cultivate the empathy, the sensitivity, the openness, the consideration, and at the same time, to not capitulate, to not give in, to not give up. Win-win basically means we consent together. Now, sometimes it's not practical. I know that. So you merely agree to disagree agreeably. We call this no deal. So you go for win-win or you go for no deal. It's not going to work out. I'm not going to sell to you. I'm not going to hire you. I'm not going to buy from you or whatever. So no deal is certainly one of the options. Maybe at a later time you can come together in a win-win way on another issue. So if you're deeply committed to win-win or no deal, you can be absolutely open and honest. You have no hidden negotiation techniques. You just basically say, I want us both to win. That's not a whim as I see it, but I need to understand why it is a win for you. Let me understand. Then back and forth, you try to understand each other. And as you do that, genuinely, sincerely, something very dynamic happens. You move from a transactional to a transformational relationship. And the spirit of empathic understanding has a magical effect upon the human spirit and upon the quality of the relationship.
This completes the second CD. Please insert the third CD to continue with the program. Stephen next describes Habit 5. Seek first to understand, then to be understood. Learning how to communicate effectively and empathically is one of the master skills in family and organizational life, and is the key to building win-win relationships.
Now let's move on to Habit 5. Seek first to understand, then to be understood. You see, the whole key in Habit 5 is the sequence between these two expressions. Seek first to understand, then to be understood. Most people literally do the very opposite. In fact, notice your own tendencies. Do you want to be understood before you seek to understand? The tendency of most all people is to listen with the intent to reply, not with the intent to understand. That's the most common tendency in us all. In most conversations, most interactions, the only desire is to be understood. Why? That's part of the need to be loved. We talked about to live, to love, to learn, to leave a legacy. Love truly makes the world go round. To feel understood is to feel loved, and people have a need to be loved. However, the whole key to human influence is first to be influenced. Now, what does that mean? The key to having influence on another person is that they feel that they have had influence with you. That is, that you were open to them, to what they were saying and feeling, and that you were consequently influenced by them. In other words, you understood them. The key to human influence with our spouses, with our children, with our work associates, in fact with anyone, is always first to understand. That's the first point I'm trying to make here under Habit 5. This is so important because our tendencies run in an absolute opposite direction. Because everyone lives in their own world. It's a subjective world. It's a world that has its own meanings in it. Everyone has their own perceptions of what reality is. And people are walking around in these subjective worlds, and then they collide with each other. And when they have to interact with each other, they usually interact efficiently within their own world. But if they're trying to bring the worlds together to create a better world, or to come up with a new agreement or a new arrangement, of necessity, both worlds come together. And unless we seek to understand the other person's world, we will not have influence with that other person, nor they with us. Let me use a couple of physical illustrations to illustrate. Could you possibly prescribe glasses for eyes you haven't diagnosed? No, if you're wearing glasses, it's because the optometrist first sought to understand, and then build the prescription on that understanding. Another illustration. If you were to take the air out of the room you're in, or the car you're in right now, what would happen to your interest in listening to this audio teaching program? All of a sudden, you have this great sucking sound, and there's no air. What would you do? It wouldn't make any difference how interesting or how fascinating this program happened to be to you. You would want air. You'd do whatever you could do to get air. But now you get it. Now that you have air, does air motivate you? No. Your interest shifts to learning. Why? A satisfied need no longer motivates. You know what the equivalent is emotionally to air? It's to feel understood. They are then open to understand you. They're open to be influenced. But until they feel understood, nothing else you do will work with them, because inside they'll always say, he or she does not understand. When you understand another, you've accepted them. That doesn't mean you agree with them, but that you accept they are people of worth, people worth listening to. You value them, or you wouldn't have spent such time understanding them. You also accept that they see their world differently. You accept that they live in their own world and that it has legitimacy. They occupy space. They are part of the human race. See, essentially, that's air. The most basic elemental foundation of it is that you matter to me. I accept you. Why? I understand you. Why would I want to understand you if you didn't matter, if you didn't have legitimacy? You see, to love another person is to affirm them emotionally, physically, to shake their hand, to empathize with them in some way. They need to be fed this air, this human touch, this warmth, this deep communication, and it can come in many, many ways. The problem is that most of us tend to get into a very efficient state of mind. We have our own schedule. We know the kinds of things we want to accomplish. We think it through in our mind. We're under a lot of pressure. There are all kinds of things on our platter, and it's tough. And that's the way modern life is. It's a rushing, fast-moving world. It's changing. It's chaotic. It's turbulent. Well, what do we do to handle that? You have to kind of figure it out. You have to try to be efficient and schedule yourself and then carry out your schedule. But see, the problem is that when you get into an efficient state of mind, you also try to be efficient in your listening as well. And you don't really take time to listen to understand, to listen empathically, meaning to listen within the other's frame of reference. Shakespeare showed this awareness in his Henry IV, where he said, "It is the disease of not listening that I am troubled withal." In our own day of super-sophisticated, instantaneous global communication, email, the internet, far too often we suffer from this disease of not listening, particularly when we listen from within their world, their frame of reference. Carl Rogers made this brilliant observation. He said, "To be with another in this way means that for the time being you lay aside your own views and values in order to enter another's world without prejudice. In some sense, it means that you lay aside yourself. This can only be done by persons who are secure enough in themselves that they know they will not get lost in the world of the other." Unquote. Now look, if I'm into efficiency, how can I want to really open up to your world? Your world's so different than my world, and I don't know what your world is going to show me. I don't know how open it is. I don't know how many dimensions, how many variables it has. I can't enter your world. I lose my efficiency altogether, and that disturbs and imbalances almost everything else in my life. Thus, I don't want to really be empathic. That's too much risk. I get too involved. I've got too many things going. I must be efficient. So I've learned to adopt certain techniques. I pretend to listen, but I'm still basically preparing my response. Why? Because I am efficient, and I don't want to lose control. I give the impression that I'm listening. I look at you in the eye, I turn my head a little, I smile, I nod, I do other things to lead you to believe I'm listening. But I'm not really. Why? I can't risk it. I'm too vulnerable. Not just emotionally vulnerable because I'm unaware of what might happen and that I might have to change, but I'm also vulnerable in terms of my whole life. I'm not efficient any longer. I'm out of control. I cannot accomplish as much.
I think the problem that I have with habit 5 is probably the same problem all of us do. We are the sum of our experiences. We filter everything that comes in through that cumulative knowledge, that all of those experiences that we've had, prior dealings, and we typically end up with a lot of preconceived notions about, what's being said or why it's being said, but we evaluate that from our context, from our frame of reference. So in seeking to understand, consciously I know that I have to separate myself as much as possible from my frame of reference so I can get in their shoes, I can see where they're coming from. The only way I've found to deal with it is just to constantly remind myself that perception is reality, and these people, even if it's not my reality, it's theirs.
My mentor, really, for Habit 5 has been my husband. He is amazing at just listening and understanding, and before he even says a word or makes a suggestion, it's all about understanding where I'm coming from. And that is a skill I'm really trying to learn from him. It's very valuable.
I consider myself a really good listener, and I tend to focus on what's really going on around me at work a lot because I don't want to miss anything, and I want kind of like cohesiveness in the group. But then when I get home, I want those same things, but it's like I'm just mentally drained from doing it at work a lot of times. And so I'm like, I do that type of listening where you go, shake your head like, oh, yeah. I stick a video in for the kids, and my husband, we work different shifts, so it's really hard because, when I'm ready to talk, then he's tired and he comes home at midnight. So it's like to wake me up and get some conversation, and in the morning I'm rushing. So I know that's a skill I really need to work on, is listening to him more.
I know for myself, if I were to fault me at the highest point on these habits, it would be on trying to be efficient with people. When you're dealing with another person and they're living out of their own world and they want you involved in their world, it just slows down your world. In other words, we really have to get into a whole different frame of mind and attach ourselves to the higher values of what's really important, and to ask, is this little time thing, this efficiency need, that important? Really, did anyone on their deathbed ever wish they'd spent more time at the office? I'll tell you what they talk about. They talk about what's important, and that's relationships. With people, you can't be efficient. Remember again, fast is slow with people, and slow is fast. So to seek first to understand, then to be understood requires emotional strength. It requires patience, openness, and a desire to understand, all highly developed qualities of character. It also takes a lot of time. It really does. It's not just a quality of time, it's quantity. And the one cannot compensate for the other. But in the long run, it saves so much time. My guess is for every hour spent in correct understanding, it saves 10 to 50 to 100 hours in dealing with the problems that came from not understanding. Oh, if people only knew how much time they would save later on, and what a beautiful relationship they're losing out on by not taking the time initially to truly seek to understand another. Because in some ways it's very, very hard to catch up later. But it can still be done, and I would not become discouraged.
Truly effective individuals recognize their own perceptual limitations and learn how to benefit from diversity. Synergistic outcomes in families and organizations frequently result from valuing differences and seeking third alternatives, as Stephen explains in Habit 6, entitled Synergize.
Habit 6, synergize, in a sense, is the fruit of the spirit of Habit 4, think win-win, and the spirit of Habit 5, seek first to understand, then to be understood. See, when 4 and 5 are in place, what happens is a very unique and powerful thing. People are beginning to interact together genuinely. They're open to each other's influence, and new insights emerge. A new dynamic is born. Something happens to them both, and it happens between them. It creates the possibility of third alternatives. It's not an either-or approach. It's not win-lose or lose-win, and it's not a compromise. Compromise is where 1 + 1 = 1.5. But synergy is where 1 + 1 = 3, 4, 10, 50. There's also a negative form of synergy where 1 + 1 = say, 1/2. In other words, so much of the effort and energy is spent in adversarialism, in conflict and defensive and protective communication that it literally wastes the energy of the people, of the enterprise, of the marriage, of the family. And you end up with less than what one person could do, himself or herself. Anyone who has experienced sustained conflict and contention, they know what little productivity comes out. So just remember these definitions. Synergy is where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. In other words, it's the part between the parts that is the key part. Synergy means you can literally produce something that neither of you could have produced before, or even adding what each can produce separately. It's like having 2 ears. They're connected with the brain, and you end up where you can sense direction, where if you had 2 ears unconnected, you'd have no sense of direction. 1 + 1 literally equals 3 or more. Now, if you have 1 + 1 = 2, that's not synergy. That might be transaction. You go in and you buy gas and you give money. You transacted. That's not synergistic. You may have cooperated. That's not synergistic. Synergy is creative cooperation, where 1 + 1 = 3, 4, or 10. Negative synergy, as I mentioned, is where there is enough internal contention and adversarialism that it produces less than even what one person can produce on their own, because so much of the energy is wasted going in the wrong direction. In other words, it's counterproductive. Now, the traditional paradigm of interaction, particularly when there are differences and disagreements, is to go for compromise. That's literally where most people think we end up realistically. We go for compromise. This would be where 1 + 1 = 1.5. And most people think that that's where we should go. That's what synergy means. Not so. That's realistic, however, if you're in a low-trust culture. But if you can cultivate the emotional bank account and the trust goes up, you don't need to go for compromise. If you'll pay the price with habits 4, 5, and 6, you'll come up with this dynamic new quality in life and in relationships called synergy. That really is the summum bonum of all of these other habits. I've enjoyed immensely the work of Professors Fisher and Urey as they talk about 2 people fighting about a window. One wants the window open and the other wants it closed. One keeps opening it, the other keeps closing it. It eventually becomes an ego battle between them. He opens it, walks out of the room, and the other person closes it. Then the person comes back and opens it again. It appears that there are only two positions, opened or closed. Does it seem that way to you? Or perhaps maybe a compromise position, open half the time, or perhaps open half the way? But remember, synergy is not compromise. Compromise is when 1 + 1 = 1.5. Synergy means that 1 + 1 = more than 2. Now, what other solutions could you come up with? On this window issue, it seems like it's either open or it's closed or a compromise. There are many, many other solutions. They do not yet understand the problem. And you won't know what the solutions are until you get into the underlying intent or the purpose of the person. This takes habit 5, where you seek first to understand. So one says, "What is it that you are after?" And the other responds, "I like to have the fresh air. That's why I want the window open. That's what my need is. If I don't get fresh air, I almost feel claustrophobic. It means so much to me." "What is it you want?" The other person says, "My problem is that this breeze from the outside blows my working papers about. I can't keep my things organized, and I need to have them in front of me on my desk in order to do my work efficiently." Now, what do they understand? They understand each other's need, each other's purpose, what they're trying to accomplish there, what's important to them. Now, once you understand the two things, then you say, "Now, what can we do?" Now, this is where habit 6, synergy, comes in. What could we do that could meet your need and my need? How could we get the fresh air without the draft? Now, think of the options and the alternatives that can come to your mind. Why don't we open the window in this other room? That would give the fresh air. And the other person says, "Well, I almost have to see it open or I get this claustrophobic feeling. What would you think of this if we were to organize your desk in this way and put it in this place in the room and my desk in this way? Then we'd have the fresh air and you could see it, but the draft wouldn't come over your desk." What would you think of something like that? Now notice the spirit between these two people. It's a synergistic spirit. They're creating alternatives, solutions that can meet both persons' needs. You sense that spirit? It's the spirit of empathy. It's the spirit of win-win. It's the spirit of seeking to understand. It's not defensive. It's not protective. It's not argumentative. They're not accusing each other. You see, this is the spirit of habits 4, 5, and 6. 4 is the root, R-O-O-T. 5 is the root, R-O-U-T-E. And 6 is the fruit, synergy. It's also enormously bonding in the relationship because they created something together so that no matter what else comes around, they can deal with those difficulties, with those challenges. The key to habit 6, synergize, you could almost say is to value differences. It's not something you just tolerate that there are differences, or that you just accept that there are differences. It's not something that is legislated through diversity programs to respect differences, but really, deeply, you actually celebrate differences. You realize that in the differences lies this very special creative dynamic, and that if we can demonstrate this mutual understanding, it will unleash this dynamic so that really strength lies in differences. As long as there is a common vision and principle-centered value system, then those differences become creative and productive. However, if there is not a common purpose, a common vision, a common set of principle-centered values, as well as a deep buy-in to that, then diversity, differences, will literally result in chaos and negative synergy, and it will spawn further prejudice and prejudgment. In other words, it becomes fundamentally counterproductive. That's why it requires the integrity of the first 3 habits, the development of a common purpose, a common sense of meaning, a common sense of mission, and sufficient integrity around those values that were identified, that the security goes within people so they can afford the risks of thinking win-win, of having the patience and the self-control to seek first to understand and to really be open to understanding. Then gradually you see this dynamic, magical thing happening of inventing a new spirit, inventing new approaches, third alternatives, and they are exponentially increased because of these differences. So strength literally lies in these differences. These aren't just nice words to value diversity, to value differences. These are moral imperatives for those that really want to solve problems in entirely new ways. In fact, to get new understanding of the nature of the problems themselves. Go for synergy. The moment someone disagrees with you, train yourself to say to them, or within yourself, good, you see it differently. I want to understand. Help me understand. You come from an entirely different angle. You're intelligent. You care. I want to understand. You see the spirit of that? But if you're just into independence and into efficiency and self-control and control of others, you won't feel to say, good, I'm glad there are differences. You'll end up wanting to tell them what to think, what to feel, what to do, and you'll end up turning people into things. But then that violates the relationship and you don't get synergy. At best, you get compromise. At worst, you'll get adversarialism and fighting and negative forms of synergy where 1 + 1 = less than 1, because so much of the energy of both parties is spent on fighting each other rather than dealing directly with the issues. So we're trying to move toward a positive form of synergy that creates new options through this deep understanding and interchange of differences. That's why I value my wife's input so much to my life, because she does see things differently, and I need her perspective, and I'm glad when she'll tell me it's different than the way I see it, because the wisdom that comes ultimately through the interaction is so much greater than what either of us had brought to the situation. But again, the key is to have a common vision and a common value system. Then all of the differences become a very powerful advantage, not a disadvantage. This kind of synergistic communication really is very, very taxing to people and requires considerable maturity. And if you have peripheral issues that are secondary, you may not feel like you have that level of energy and commitment to tap into that kind of energy that is needed. In fact, Sandra and I have found a very fast and easy way to deal with these secondary issues. We simply say to each other, where are you? That means to us, on a scale of 1 to 10, how important is this to you? If she'll say it's a 9 and I'll say it's a 3, then we do it her way. Or vice versa. We make no effort to go toward synergy, toward a third alternative, because we don't have that much time and that much energy to spend in that kind of communication. We both have agreed up front that we'd be totally honest on our appraisal of how important it is. From time to time, we've also done this with our children, so that if we get in a car and we're going somewhere and we don't have time to resolve it synergistically, we might just say, how strong do you feel about it on a scale of 1 to 10? And when people always try to show respect for those who feel the strongest, and when your happiness is tied up into their happiness and fulfillment, that's truly win-win, even though you didn't get your way, because your higher interest is in their happiness. In other words, it's a kind of democracy that shows respect for the strength of feelings, the depth of feeling behind a person's opinions or desire. It's a very efficient way of solving problems rapidly without having to go towards synergistic communication on everything. This idea of synergy may be just words to you till you actually experience it. You could hear this and still tonight get embroiled with your spouse in some kind of a fight, or with your kids, or have some other negative interaction with someone at work, and then immediately seek first to be understood. The most dreaded thing to happen in a marriage or in the family or in an organization is to destroy the ability to communicate synergistically and to solve problems this way. You see, we always see the world not as it is, but as we are. So we must constantly seek to understand, and most of us tend to think we see the world as it is, that we're objective, and that we're looking through our lens of wisdom and experience, but in fact we're looking through our lens of conditioning, of prior scripting. We referred to that as a paradigm before, a pair of glasses, a frame of reference out of which we operate, the implicit assumptions that we operate on, or the map. The key to objectivity is to realize we're subjective. It's to be aware. I do not see the world as it is. I see the world as I am. Therefore, if there is a difference, what about it? Someone else sees it differently based upon their experiences. I need their data. So this concept of valuing differences is not just a good idea. It's not just something that brings unity. It's something that creates through cooperative communication processes, whole new options, new alternatives, new solutions, new insights, far better solutions. And this idea of humility and accepting our subjective involvement is not just some nice principle. It is a reality that people see things differently, and we all need access to that. It's through the interaction of the spirit of habit 4, think win-win. Habit 5, the spirit of seeking first to understand, then to be understood. And as most people respectfully, empathically communicate with each other back and forth, something new happens. I honestly believe that you can take about any issue you want, where there are profound differences, and create a third alternative, if people will practice habits 4, 5, and 6. Because in those habits lie the capability of solving literally any human problem.
Effective people are involved in constant renewal and improvement in all 4 dimensions of life, which include the physical, the mental, the spiritual, and the social-emotional dimensions. Stephen explains in this final habit, Habit 7, entitled Sharpen the Saw, why constant nourishment of our 4 dimensions is essential to combat the inevitable effects of complacency and stagnation.
The final habit, Habit 7, Sharpen the Saw, is the habit of renewal. What are you doing? Well, can't you see I'm sawing down this tree? Oh, I'll bet you're tired. I am. Well, how long you been doing it? Oh, I don't know, 2, 3 hours? I'll bet you're beat. Boy, I'll say, I've never been so tired. Well, why don't you sharpen the saw? I'm too busy sawing, dum-dum. Have you ever been too busy driving to take time to get gas? The opposite of sharpening the saw is to leave it dull until the blade breaks, until the mind becomes dull, the spirit insensitive, the body flabby, where everything has gone to pot, literally and figuratively. To sharpen the saw is basically to say, I'm going to keep renewing myself and keeping my entire life in balance. This concept of sharpening the saw applies to 4 levels: personally, interpersonally, managerially, organizationally. It's fundamentally the concept of continuous improvement, continuous learning, forever getting better. Habit 7, in a sense, is the habit that focuses on production capability. Habit 7, if done right, automatically renews and develops the other 6 habits, because it takes a high level of proactivity and of responsibility and initiative to consistently sharpen the saw. I do not know of one activity that has as great a leverage factor in life as Habit 7. Look on it this way. Habit 7 moves the fulcrum over. You may only spend a few hours in an entire week, which is made up of 168 hours, but those few hours will affect the quality, the productivity, the satisfaction, the quality of relationships, the quality of decision-making of every other hour. That's like moving the fulcrum over. But here's the problem. Habit 7 lies in quadrant 2. It's important, however, it's not urgent. That's why most people neglect it. In fact, all of the habits lie in quadrant 2. They're all terribly important, but not urgent. And Habit 7, which in a sense enables all the other 6 habits to be constantly renewed, obviously is important but not urgent. It does not act upon us. We must act upon it. Otherwise, if we neglect this, our lives become disordered. We do things unsystematically. We hit and miss. And then we end up with imbalanced lives and imbalanced organizations that focus myopically only on one dimension. Basically, there are 4 dimensions in life: the body, the mind, the spirit, and our relationships, that is, the social-emotional side. The same thing applies to organizations. There are the same 4 dimensions. It has its physical, or what we might call its economic side, to produce the bottom line towards some mission within a certain value system. That is the spiritual side. It must also have its culture of high trust. That's the social side. In order to have empowerment in the development and use of people's talents, that's the mental side. So those are the same 4 dimensions. In fact, if you study all of history, philosophy, religion, and psychology, inevitably you'll find the same dimensions constantly mentioned: the physical, mental, spiritual, and social-emotional. But all 4 needs need to be attended to be renewed and nurtured in a consistent and regular and balanced way in order to properly sharpen the saw.
I am a marathon runner, and in order to run a marathon, I have to plan for it and train for it and get ready for it and do the things around good nutrition and enough sleep and scheduling the time for that. So just in this activity that for me starts out being physically sharpening the saw, a whole lot more things have grown from that. And so it can be incredibly rewarding. And if I didn't have that, if I didn't do that, I would not be good in the other things.
Part of my renewal process, part of sharpening the saw for me, is attending college. I'm currently working on another degree, and after I finish this one, I'll probably start another one. I'm a lifelong learner. It's how I invest in myself. So when I'm feeling stressed, for me a textbook can be very relaxing. It's therapy.
These are the ways that I sharpen the saw. I start the morning by doing some kind of meditation and then read something that is inspirational for me that I hope will carry over in the day. But the things that interest me right now are inspirational, spiritual things and personal growth.
Let's look at each one in turn. Under physical, we usually think about these elements of renewal: exercise, nutrition, and stress management, so that we're not crippled and paralyzed from being overstressed, overtaxed, worn out, burned out. Regarding exercise, there is more and more consciousness throughout all society about the importance of it and the effect it has upon our body, upon our sense of well-being, our fitness. But you know, the main benefit isn't necessarily physical fitness. It's what happens to your self-esteem. Is what happens to your sense of being in control of your life. It's the spillover effect into the other dimensions, the emotional, the social, and the spiritual, that often are the primary benefits of physical exercise. Even beyond physical fitness, as great as that is, beyond feeling better, looking better. And nutrition is also becoming increasingly important, where we learn to subordinate taste to nutrition, to what is good for us, and people inwardly know so much that they do not now do. Let's look at stress for a moment. There's so much written about it, and so many programs that focus on a number of different things, such as meditation, biofeedback, exercise, and so forth, and I think these are all excellent. But I'm convinced that the greatest stress management idea I have ever learned lies in having a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose, and a sense of integrity around a value system. In the language of Hans Selye, the international expert on stress, to have this kind of meaningful work creates eustress, E-U-S-T-R-E-S-S, not distress. And eustress strengthens the immune systems, slows down the degenerative forces of the body, and strengthens our whole ability to cope with the realities of life. I also believe that the stress of a conscience that has been violated again and again transcends by far the stress of deadlines, pressing meetings, and having a dozen balls in the air at the same time. So I think we should deal with both sides of stress, the environmental and the profoundly personal, in cultivating a sense of meaning, of purpose, and of living by our conscience around principle-centered values. Now let's look at the mental dimension, to put forth a great effort to keep our minds vital, alert, and alive, to get into reading, to turn the television way down. There's good in some of it, but too much of it is like an open sewer, pouring its contents into the home with all the violence and promiscuity and betrayal and filth and incivility in behavior and language. I'm convinced that excessive television can tend to keep family members away from reading, from serious and fun family interaction. If you sense your family is too addicted to it, or if you're too addicted to television, try this. Go cold turkey off it for a month and watch the withdrawal screams. It'll tell you about the level of your addictions. Then when the withdrawal pains have gone, go back to it in appropriate and careful and planned ways, so that its entertainment and educational benefits come into the family without all of its negative sides. Early on with our children, we involved them in an awareness of what happens to a family. They looked at the hard data and then essentially walked out of the room, and they came up with the resolve to have very little television, no more than an hour a day, and instead to focus on homework, reading, development, social interaction, and I'm convinced it has made a significant difference in our family life. Get back to reading. Give yourself the challenge of reading a book a month, and then perhaps a book a week, and read broadly, widely, deeply, even outside your own comfort zone, so that you're constantly expanding and deepening your horizons. And writing is one of the most powerful mental tools. To learn to write. In fact, I don't know any discipline of the mind as powerful as writing, more demanding, taking more concentration of effort. I believe that what exercise is to the body, reading is to the mind, but writing is like concentrated mental exercise because you have to gather and distill and crystallize into words for another person's mind, and it causes you to think empathically and to get very conscious about the communication processes. I commend to you also the keeping of a journal, a personal history. I commend to you writing letters again, for the art of letter writing is just about gone with the convenience of the telephone and more recently the email and the internet. But learning to express your thoughts deeply and beautifully to other people is one of the great arts in life. With all the changes that are taking place in the world today, where it's believed generally that most professions have a half-life of about 4 years, it takes constant commitment to learning, to education, and to paying the price in deep thinking and reading, just to keep abreast, just to keep up on what's happening. But to get ahead of what's happening requires even more mental concentration, effort, and energy. The spiritual dimension is a very private area. People do it in their own way, but basically it means to renew yourself in your value system, in your sense of purpose and meaning and vision, in what you deeply, deeply believe in and value, what you treasure. Work on this mission statement. Work diligently on it until it gradually crystallizes within you. When it gets settled into your core, then keep going back to it, exploring it to see if it still is relevant to your present situation. You write it as if it will be forever, but you have to keep looking at it. You try to make it up of principles that are timeless and universal and self-explanatory. Sometimes it helps to get into nature, to get into meadows, in forests, at an ocean, or even in visual images of these things, so that you're always being grounded into the earth. There's a power that comes from this that does not come from artificial made things. Sometimes you can renew it by renewing your commitments, your vows to your loved ones, to whatever is important and sacred to you. Sometimes you can renew your spirit by studying the great literature that inspires you, from praying and pondering, from trying to get a sense of reaching to a higher level, of making a difference, of contributing, of just getting out of your own world and your own satisfactions. Reading has entertainment value, to be sure, but to try to get inspirational reading, that kind of reading that truly edifies and uplifts your spirit, that educates your conscience and makes you very sensitive to what is right and what is wrong and what can be done and what the potential is inside another person, so that you see them with a believing heart and so that your moral sense is deep and you can detect whenever you violate it, so that you can return to that which is right and proper. Read the great literature of your own faith tradition or your intellectual tradition, literature that you love, that inspires you. Read the biographies and autobiographies of the people you identify with. Model after them. Think about the great heroes of your life and the qualities you admire most about them, so that you can constantly feed and educate your conscience and live by it day in and day out. To be courageous in the hard moments, little by little, the conscience is made strong and viable and powerful. It gives you tremendous social courage as well. You can learn to say no to all kinds of temptations and expedient compromising paths. Your conscience becomes strong. It feeds you. It feeds your sense of identity and worth. It gives you a sense of abundance, so that your sense of worth does not come from being compared. All of this is part of the spiritual sharpening of the saw. As I mentioned, all people do it differently. It is such a private and personal world. But it must not be neglected because it is part of our very natures. Now finally, let's look at the social-emotional dimension. Social means your relationships with others, and emotional refers to your relationship with yourself in relation to others, as well as with yourself. One of the most powerful action steps you can take after today is to begin the process of rebuilding a broken relationship you care about enormously. Reach out to touch the one that tests you the very most. Rebuild that relationship you care so much about, but which is strained and which has been wounded. Dag Hammarskjöld, the Secretary General of the United Nations of an earlier era, put it this way: "It is more noble to give yourself completely to one individual than to labor diligently for the salvation of the masses." In other words, you can be very dedicated for many causes out there, worthy causes, projects, business activities, spending 10, 12, 14 hours a day, 6, 7 days a week, and yet not have a meaningful relationship with your own teenage son. And that will eat at you. It weakens your fiber and your will. It affects the totality of your life in some sense. If there's a sense of enmity within you, it will spread out and affect other things. Negative energy is like a metastasizing cancer that spreads out and affects the totality of our life. Positive energy also has the same pervasive effect on everything in our life. So if you can nurture all of the key relationships of your life, it is amazing the kind of moral and social courage it gives you in other relationships, business, community, church, or whatever. You'll also find that in your efforts to rebuild some one relationship you care about a great deal, that it creates more nobility of character within that will affect all other relationships. The key, in a sense, to the 99 is the one, because everyone is a one. The key to the many is the one. Why? Because what you have to do to develop and educate and discipline your character affects everything that you do in your life. It literally has exponential leveraging capacity in all relationships. The home is usually the perfect place for this social emotional renewal. Spending time together at the family dinner, having special family traditions, holidays, birthdays, playing together, relaxing together, worshiping together, laughing, empathically listening to each other, honoring each other, lifting each other up when there is discouragement and despair, encouraging each other, nurturing each other's emotional bank account, affirming each other. All of this is so vital and part of this social and emotional sharpening the saw. So to be committed to habit 7 is to continuously jumpstart your own mind and spirit and body and your relationships on a consistent basis. And that, to me, is the first early commitment to make now. Don't ever neglect sharpening the saw. Don't come up with reasons for not doing it. Pay the price, my friends. The dividends are unbelievably marvelous.
Stephen now concludes his discussion of the 7 habits by sharing several challenges that will help you begin to implement these habits and principles in your life.
Let me share with you now a few thoughts and challenges to encourage you in the process of developing these habits. One of the most important things you can do right now is to begin to share these ideas with others. When you teach once, you learn twice. You learn better. It deepens your commitment to apply. It also unfreezes the labels that people have of you because they see you growing and learning, and they give you new opportunities to change and to become better. So when you teach other people and share with your family, your work associates, and others who might have an interest, that's when the real learning begins to take place. It is in the teaching and in the sharing and in the living. Sometimes it helps to focus on a single habit. You don't try to change everything at once. However, you'll find that the habits are so interwoven that any time you begin to work on one of them in a significant, deep way, it will affect all of the rest. But start with those things that are most important for you to work on right now. And remember, don't ever give up. Be patient. A strong character is not developed overnight. Choose to live your life based upon principles. All of the 7 habits are based on universal principles which have endured through the ages. And how do you know that they are universal, timeless, and self-evident? Just try arguing against any one of them, and imagine a highly effective person with no sense of responsibility. Habit 1. No vision. Habit 2. No integrity. Habit 3. No mutual respect. Habit 4. No mutual understanding. Habit 5. No creative cooperation. Habit 6. No renewal. Habit 7. The power of these habits is in the doing, in the living, in the continuous day-by-day improvements. It's a constant effort. We need to make these habits and these principles a part of our very life. But it takes great patience. Consider the Chinese bamboo tree that is planted and you see nothing for 4 years except a little bulb and a little shoot coming from it. But literally you work diligently day in and day out to optimize the whole growing situation, and you see nothing. On the 5th year, the Chinese bamboo tree grows up to 80 feet. All of the growth goes above the ground, where before all of the growth went below the ground. To some degree, there is some relevance here. The first 3 habits of the private victory are in a sense below the ground, and above the ground represents habits 4, 5, and 6 in our relationships with other people. Another thing I'm sure you've learned about these habits is that you already know them. They already live in your own heart. In fact, I love the quote from T.S. Eliot, who identified this deep inner knowing and awareness. He said, "We must never cease from exploring, and the end of all of our exploring will be to arrive where we began and know the place for the first time." Again, you see, in a very real sense, you already know these habits in your heart. But the exciting thing is to embark on a lifelong adventure of learning them, of sharing them, of literally internalizing them, and living them to the point that you can experience the magnificent fruits that will come in the totality of your lives and in all of your relationships.
This concludes the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People audio learning program. We hope Stephen's presentation has helped deepen your understanding and commitment to implement these habits and principles in day-to-day life at home and at work. To request a free catalog or additional information about Covey Leadership Center products, programs, and services, please call 1-800-553-8889.